At Aero 822 hours on April 7, 1945, Seaman First Class Robert Matthews squinted through the salted glass of his observation post aboard the destroyer USS Hackleback. The radar scope painted a picture that made his pulse quicken. 10 surface contacts steaming southwest at 15 knots through the East China Sea. He reached for the handset, his finger already keying the transmit button, but it was what he didn't see that would seal the fate of 3,700 men that morning. No fighter cover. The largest battleship ever constructed was sailing naked into the largest concentration of American carrier airpower in the Pacific. Matthews double-checked his radar returns, scanning the skies above the Japanese formation. Nothing. He'd been tracking enemy ships for 18 months, and he'd never seen a capital ship without at least a protective umbrella of fighters. The Japanese weren't just abandoning air superiority. They were abandoning the very principle that had defined naval warfare since 1942. The voice that came through his headset next belonged to Lieutenant Commander Eugene Sarsfield, officer of the deck. "Confirm that radar contact, Matthews, and confirm no air cover." Matthews pressed his binoculars against his eye sockets hard enough to hurt. 6 paltry fighters circled the formation, almost an insult. "Confirmed, sir. Surface Special Attack Force. Minimal fighter protection." Before we explore why this observation sent shock waves through the American command structure, we need to understand what was at stake in those waters. If you're finding this deep dive into naval history compelling, consider subscribing. We bring you these untold stories from the Pacific War every week, and your support helps us continue this mission. The battle for Okinawa had begun 6 days earlier. On April 1st, 1,300 ships of the United States Fifth Fleet had delivered 180,000 American troops onto Japanese soil for the first time in the war. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the largest naval armada ever assembled, protecting what military planners called Operation Iceberg. The stakes were existential. Okinawa sat just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. Its capture would provide air bases for the final assault on Japan itself. The Japanese understood the mathematics of annihilation. They'd watched the Americans island hop across the Pacific, each landing bringing B-29 bombers closer to Tokyo. Saipan had fallen. Iwo Jima had fallen. Now Okinawa was being torn from their grasp, and with it, any hope of negotiating a conditional surrender. Emperor Hirohito himself had demanded to know where his navy was while the army prepared its defense. The question cut deep. The once mighty combined fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf 6 months earlier. What remained were scattered units, desperately short of fuel, hiding in the inland sea. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, understood that conventional naval operations were finished, but doing nothing was politically impossible. The emperor had asked his question, and it demanded an answer written in steel and blood. Toyota conceived Operation Tengo, a name that barely concealed its true nature. The plan was simple in its desperation. Send the battleship Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers on a one-way mission to Okinawa. They would carry just enough fuel for the journey south. No return voyage was planned. No return voyage was possible. The Yamato herself was a monument to a dying age. Laid down in 1937 at the Kure Naval Arsenal, she represented Japan's attempt to offset American industrial superiority with individual ship quality. Her designers had created a vessel that defied every convention of battleship construction. Her main armament consisted of 9 46-centimeter guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed 1,160 kilograms and could penetrate 410 millimeters of armor at 25,000 meters. Her armor belt measured 410 millimeters thick. Her armored citadel featured transverse bulkheads 355 millimeters thick. She displaced 72 1,800 tons fully loaded, making her heavier than any American or British battleship. But size and armor meant nothing without air cover, and Japan's naval aviation had been systematically destroyed. At Midway in June 1942, 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable aircrew had gone to the bottom. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Marianas Turkey Shoot had annihilated another generation of pilots. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the remaining carriers had served as decoys, empty shells sent north to die, while the surface fleet made its doomed charge. By April 1945, Japan possessed neither the aircraft nor the trained pilots to protect a surface action group. The men who would crew Yamato on her final voyage learned of the mission on April 5th. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commanding the Surface Special Attack Force, assembled his officers in the battleship's wardroom. The word special attack needed no translation. Since October 1944, it had become the euphemism for suicide missions. Kamikaze pilots flew special attacks. Now surface ships would do the same. The orders were explicit: sail to Okinawa, fight through the American fleet, beach the ship on the island's shore, and use her massive guns as coastal artillery until she was destroyed or her ammunition was exhausted. The crew would then join the Army defenders and fight to the end. Admiral Ito had protested. A career surface warfare officer, he understood that sending Yamato without air cover was murder, not military strategy. He'd argued for canceling the operation, calling it a meaningless sacrifice, but the decision came from the highest levels. The Emperor had asked his question. The Navy would provide its answer. Ito received one concession: any crew member could voluntarily remain behind. The sick bay was emptied. Trainees and recent recruits were ordered ashore. But when Yamato cast off her moorings on the evening of April 6th, 2,787 men remained aboard. Most had chosen to sail, knowing they would never return. The force passed through the Bungo Strait after dark, steering south through waters that should have been protected by friendly air patrols. Instead, 6 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters appeared at dawn, a token gesture that fooled no one. The pilots knew what the sailors knew: this was a death ride. American submarines prowled these waters. American carrier task forces operated with impunity. The Yamato and her escorts were sailing into a killing zone with their eyes open. Aboard the battleship, 16-year-old Seaman Mitsuru Yoshida stood his watch in the communications room. He'd joined the Navy believing Yamato was unsinkable, that her massive armor could withstand anything the Americans threw at her. Now, watching the handful of fighters circling overhead, reality settled into his stomach like cold iron. The veterans weren't talking about tactics or gunnery solutions. They were writing letters they knew would never be delivered, saying prayers to ancestors they would soon join. The American submarine USS Threadfin detected the Japanese formation at 2,000 hours on April 6th, tracking the ships as they cleared the strait. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander John Foote, shadowed the force through the night, transmitting contact reports every hour. The USS Hackleback picked up the trail at 0500 on April 7th. Both submarines noted the absence of combat air patrol, the lack of air search radar emissions, the vulnerability of the formation. Their contact reports reached Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis within minutes. Spruance had access to something the Japanese didn't know he possessed: ultra-intelligence. The Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known as FRUPAC, had broken Japanese naval codes years earlier. Spruance knew Yamato was coming before she cleared the Bungo Strait. He knew her destination, her fuel state, even the time her air cover would end. FRUPAC had intercepted the message stating fighter protection would terminate at 1,000 hours. After that, Yamato would be alone. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force that had been hammering Japanese positions across the Pacific for 2 years. His 4 carrier task groups operated northeast of Okinawa, positioned to intercept kamikaze attacks. When Spruance relayed the submarine contact reports, Mitcher's staff began plotting an intercept. The carriers would need to steam south to launch position, but time was on their side. Yamato was making just 15 knots, conserving her limited fuel. The American carriers could make 30 knots and launch aircraft from 300 miles away. At 0600 hours, Mitcher issued the execute order. All 4 task groups would launch strikes against the Japanese surface force. This would be no divided effort, no piecemeal attack. Every available aircraft would participate. The objective was simple: sink Yamato before she could reach Okinawa. The American carrier decks erupted into controlled chaos. Ordnancemen rolled torpedoes from magazines. Aviation fuel crews topped off fighter tanks. Pilots received their briefings in ready rooms across the task force. 1 battleship, 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers, minimal air cover. It sounded too easy. Veterans of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf knew that attacking warships was never easy, but attacking a battleship without fighter protection was unprecedented. At 0823, the first American search planes found the Japanese formation. Lieutenant Bill Delaney, flying a Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver from USS Essex, spotted the distinctive pagoda mast of Yamato cutting through the morning haze. He keyed his radio. Jackpot! Bearing 290, distance 250 miles from Point Zebra. 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, 8 destroyers, course 205, speed 15 knots. Then he added the observation that would determine the battle's outcome. No fighter cover observed. Repeat, no fighter cover. The response was immediate. 8 F-6F Hellcat fighters raced to the scene, establishing a combat air patrol over the Japanese force. They circled at 10,000 feet, far beyond the range of Yamato's anti-aircraft guns, waiting for the strike aircraft to arrive. The Japanese gunners watched the American fighters circle overhead, unable to engage, unable to drive them away. The Hellcats were spotting for the strike, radioing constant updates on Yamato's course and speed, ensuring the incoming bombers would find their target. Aboard Yamato, Admiral Ito received the inevitable report at 0840. American scout planes were shadowing the force. Fighters circled beyond gun range. The Admiral understood what was coming. He ordered the formation into anti-aircraft disposition, the destroyers forming a protective ring around the battleship and cruiser. He increased speed to 20 knots, then to 25 knots, burning fuel he couldn't replace, but buying time he desperately needed. The fire control officers energized the radar-directed anti-aircraft systems. The crew closed up at battle stations. Then they waited. The young sailors manning Yamato's 25mm anti-aircraft guns understood their role in what was coming. They'd trained for this moment, practiced tracking high-speed aircraft, learned to lead their targets. But training against towed sleeves was different from facing dive bombers and torpedo planes piloted by men who'd survived 2 years of Pacific combat. Seaman Yoshifuji, just 15 years old, gripped the handles of his gun mount, watching the American fighters circle overhead like sharks around a drowning man. At 1,000 hours, exactly when Frupak had predicted, the 6 Japanese Zero fighters broke off and turned north. Their fuel was exhausted, or their orders had expired, or their pilots had simply acknowledged the futility of their presence. They disappeared into the northern sky, leaving Yamato completely exposed. In the radio rooms of Task Force 58, operators noted the time in their logs. The Japanese were now naked. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Houck led the first strike wave from USS San Jacinto. His formation comprised 280 aircraft. F-6F Hellcat fighters armed with bombs and rockets, SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers carrying 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers loaded with Mark 13 aerial torpedoes. The Avengers flew at wave-top height, approaching from multiple bearings to split the Japanese defensive fire. The dive bombers climbed to 10,000 feet, positioning for their attack runs. The fighters would strafe first, suppressing the anti-aircraft gunners. At 12:32, lookouts aboard Yamato sighted the first wave. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding the cruiser Yahagi, would later describe what he saw: massive formations of aircraft circling the Japanese force just beyond anti-aircraft range. Some circled clockwise, some counterclockwise, as strike leaders organized their attacks with the calm precision of a training exercise. No Japanese fighters rose to challenge them. No friendly combat air patrol arrived to disrupt their formations. The Americans had complete air superiority, and they used it to choreograph Yamato's destruction with methodical efficiency. At 12:34, Yamato opened fire with her forward main battery turrets. The big guns elevated to their maximum 45-degree angle, firing special anti-aircraft shells called Sanshikidan. These shells contained hundreds of incendiary tubes and shrapnel elements, designed to burst in front of aircraft formations and create a wall of fire and metal. The massive guns roared, their concussion rattling equipment throughout the ship. The shells burst at 10,000 feet, creating spectacular black flowers against the morning sky. They had absolutely no effect. The American formations simply flew around the bursts, adjusting their approach angles. At 12:37, the attack began. Hellcat fighters screamed down in near vertical dives, their 650 caliber machine guns hosing the battleship's decks. Rockets rippled from wing rails, exploding against the superstructure. The strafing runs had one purpose: kill the anti-aircraft gunners. The 50 caliber rounds punched through the thin splinter shields protecting the 25-millimeter gun positions. Men died at their weapons, shredded by bullets or cut down by rocket fragments. Young Yoshifuji, manning his gun mount on the starboard side, saw the fighter coming straight at him, saw the muzzle flashes twinkling along its wings, felt the impacts stitching across his position. The gun captain beside him simply folded over his weapon, dead before he hit the deck. Then came the dive bombers. The Helldivers rolled into their attacks from 10,000 feet, their pilots lining up Yamato's massive deck in their bomb sights. The battleship's captain executed emergency turns, throwing the helm hard over, trying to throw off the bomber's aim. Yamato heeled into her turns, her massive bulk responding with surprising agility. The first bombs missed, geysering seawater across the deck. But there were too many bombers attacking from too many angles. At 12:40, a 1,000-pound bomb struck the battleship's starboard side near the number 1 127-millimeter gun mount. The explosion tore through the deck, killing the entire gun crew and starting fires in the ready ammunition lockers. The torpedo planes came in last, skimming the wave tops at 200 knots. The Avenger pilots had received specific instructions: concentrate on the port side. By hitting Yamato repeatedly on one side, they would create asymmetric flooding that the damage control teams couldn't counterbalance. The battleship would develop a list, and that list would eventually capsize her. The first torpedo struck at 12:41, hitting Yamato's port side amidships. The Mark 13 torpedo carried a 600-pound Torpex warhead that detonated against the ship's underwater armor belt. The explosion opened a hole 12 meters wide, flooding 2 boiler rooms instantly. Engineers died at their posts, scalded by superheated steam, or drowned in the rushing seawater. Yahagi, attempting to draw fire away from the battleship, succeeded too well. At 12:46, a torpedo struck her engine room with surgical precision. The explosion killed every man in the engineering spaces, destroying the turbines and bringing the cruiser to a dead stop. She became a stationary target. 6 more torpedoes found her in the next 3 minutes. 12 bombs struck her superstructure. The destroyer Isakaze tried to come to her aid and was immediately swarmed by dive bombers. Both ships were dying, but the Americans weren't finished with Yamato. The second wave arrived at 13:20, another 100 aircraft from USS Yorktown, USS Intrepid, and USS Langley. They found Yamato already damaged, listing 5 degrees to port, trailing oil, but still making 15 knots and still firing every gun that remained operational. The anti-aircraft fire looked terrifying from a distance, a seemingly impenetrable wall of tracers and explosions. But American pilots quickly realized the fire was wildly inaccurate. The radar-directed fire control systems had been knocked offline by earlier bomb hits. The gunners were aiming manually. Tracking by eye and high-speed aircraft were nearly impossible to hit without computer assistance. The Americans pressed home their attacks. More torpedoes struck the port side. The damage control teams, led by Commander Noboru Owada, fought to control the flooding. They counter-flooded starboard compartments, trying to level the ship. But the asymmetric torpedo hits overwhelmed their efforts. Each new torpedo on the port side drove Yamato's list deeper. At 5 degrees, she could still fight. At 10 degrees, her main guns began losing their range of motion. At 15 degrees, walking across the deck became difficult. At 13:30, the third wave arrived, the final nail in a coffin already half closed. These pilots saw a dying ship listing heavily, burning in multiple locations, her speed reduced to 8 knots. But she was still afloat, and orders were orders. Sink the Yamato. The Avenger pilots concentrated on her rudder and stern, trying to destroy her steering capability. They succeeded. 3 torpedoes struck aft, one jamming the rudder hard over, the others flooding the steering gear room. Every man in that space died instantly, crushed by the pressure wave or drowned in the sudden flood. Yamato began turning in a slow circle, unable to steer, unable to control her course. In the emergency command post deep inside the armored citadel, Admiral Ito received the reports with stoic calm. The ship was taking on thousands of tons of water. The list had reached 20 degrees. Power to the main guns was failing. The radar systems were destroyed. The radio room was flooded. Men were dying in sealed compartments, drowning in darkness as seawater rose past their waists, their chests, their necks. At 14:02, with Yamato listing 35 degrees and unable to steer, Ito made his final decision. He canceled the operation, ordered the crew to abandon ship, and commanded the surviving destroyers to begin rescue operations. Because the radios were destroyed, he communicated this order by signal flags, hoisted by hand on a ship that was dying beneath his feet. The crew began abandoning ship, but the list made it nearly impossible. The port side was underwater. The starboard side towered above them like a cliff face. Men climbed toward the high side, scrambling across smooth steel plating that offered no handholds. Some jumped into the sea from heights of 30 meters. Others hesitated too long. Seaman Fukumoto, one of the few survivors, described climbing from deep inside the ship as the water rose around him. His commanding officer pulled him through a hatch just before it flooded completely. When Fukumoto reached the main deck, he saw dead gunners laid out in rows, saw the ship's list so severe that one of the main turrets was completely submerged. The starboard side had become the top of the ship. Men slid down the smooth hull plating and jumped into the oil-slicked sea. Admiral Ito retired to his cabin. The exact moment of his death remains unknown, but survivors reported he chose to remain aboard, going down with his ship as naval tradition demanded. In the radio room, Lieutenant Junior Grade Mitsuru Yoshida made a final decision. The radio equipment was already underwater, but the code books remained. He grabbed what he could and fought his way toward the light. The ship was rolling onto her side now, the list exceeding 80 degrees. Men were falling, sliding, tumbling into the sea or against bulkheads. The sounds were indescribable, the shriek of tearing metal, the roar of escaping steam, the screams of men trapped below decks. At 14:23, Yamato's forward magazines detonated. The explosion was visible from 100 miles away, a mushroom cloud that climbed 20,000 feet into the afternoon sky. The shock wave capsized nearby destroyers, killed men swimming in the water, and was recorded by seismographs in Japan. The ship's bow disintegrated, torn apart by the detonation of hundreds of tons of propellant and high explosive. What remained of the hull rolled completely over and slid beneath the surface. From first sighting to final sinking, the battle had lasted less than 2 hours. The largest battleship ever built was gone. In the water, men struggled to survive. The sea was covered with fuel oil, thick and choking. Swimmers who got oil in their mouths vomited, weakening quickly. The oil ignited in places, creating patches of fire that men desperately swam around. Some had life jackets. Most didn't. The lucky ones were pulled from the water by the surviving destroyers within the first hour. Others floated for 4 hours before rescue arrived. Many didn't survive. The explosions underwater had ruptured internal organs, causing internal bleeding that slowly killed men who appeared uninjured. Fukumoto remembered swimming through a sea filled with bodies, some face down, some face up, all dead. The destroyer crews who conducted rescue operations showed extraordinary courage, stopping their ships in waters where American aircraft still circled overhead. They pulled oil-soaked sailors from the sea, dragged them aboard, wrapped them in blankets. The survivors were taken to a location where they were hidden for a week, scrubbed clean to hide the evidence of the disaster, and eventually returned to Japan. Of the 2,167 men who sailed aboard Yamato, only 269 survived. The cruiser Yahagi lost 446 of her 473-man crew. 4 destroyers were sunk. More than 3,700 Japanese sailors died in the battle. American losses totaled 10 aircraft and 12 airmen. The reaction in the United States was muted satisfaction rather than triumphant celebration. The sinking of Yamato was tactically significant but strategically irrelevant. The battle for Okinawa would continue for another 2 months, costing 12,000 American lives and 110,000 Japanese lives. The kamikazes would sink 32 American ships and damage 368 more. The land battle would become a grinding attrition that foreshadowed what an invasion of Japan itself would entail. The sinking of one battleship, however large, changed none of this. For the Japanese, Yamato's loss symbolized something far more profound. The battleship had been a national symbol, proof that Japanese engineering and fighting spirit could compete with American industrial might. Her loss demonstrated the futility of that belief. No amount of courage or individual quality could overcome the systematic application of American air power. The Japanese had sent their most powerful warship on a suicide mission because they had no other options. They had no fuel for realistic operations, no air cover to protect surface ships, no strategic alternatives. Operation Tengo was desperation disguised as offensive action, and it fooled no one. The American lookouts and radar operators who first detected Yamato sailing without air cover had understood immediately what they were seeing. This wasn't a naval operation in any conventional sense. This was a sacrifice, a ritual offering to national honor that would change nothing about the war's trajectory. When Seaman Matthews had confirmed no air cover to his commanding officer, he'd known he was reporting a death sentence. The Japanese were sailing their largest battleship into the teeth of American carrier power without fighter protection, without hope, without any rational expectation of success. What the lookouts said varied from ship to ship, from man to man. Some expressed disbelief, some felt professional respect for the courage required to embark on such a mission, some felt pity. But underneath every reaction was the same fundamental understanding. The Japanese had run out of options. This wasn't Pearl Harbor, when Japanese aircraft had struck without warning. This wasn't Midway, when both sides had fought carrier versus carrier on roughly equal terms. This was the end game, the final desperate throw of dice by a nation that had already lost but refused to surrender. The lookouts had seen the future in their radar screens and binoculars that April morning. They'd seen a Navy that had ceased to function as a coherent fighting force, reduced to gestures and symbols. They'd seen men sent to die not because their deaths would change the war's outcome, but because their leaders couldn't conceive of not sending them. They'd seen the fundamental asymmetry of the Pacific War in 1945. American industrial power could replace every lost ship, every lost aircraft. Japan could replace nothing. 60 years later, the wreck of Yamato lies in 120 feet of water in the East China Sea. Japanese survey teams have located the debris field, photographed the massive main turrets that broke free during the sinking, documented the scattered remains. The wreck is considered a war grave, protected by Japanese law. Occasionally, divers retrieve artifacts, a sake cup, a personal seal, a watch frozen at 1423 hours. These objects tell individual stories of the men who died, but the larger story is written in the strategic decisions that sent them to their deaths. Operation Tengo achieved nothing militarily. The surviving destroyers returned to Japan without engaging American surface forces. The kamikaze attacks continued with or without naval support. Okinawa fell on June 21st, exactly as American planners had predicted. The capture provided air bases for B-29 bombers, which intensified the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities. On August 6th and 9th, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. None of this would have been different if Yamato had remained in port. But understanding Operation Tengo requires understanding the context in which it was conceived. By April 1945, Japan's military and civilian leadership existed in a state of cognitive dissonance. They knew the war was lost. Ultra-intercepts of Japanese diplomatic communications show clearly that leaders understood defeat was inevitable, but surrender was culturally and politically impossible. The military code of Bushido demanded fighting to the death. The concept of unconditional surrender was intolerable, so Japan's leaders chose to continue fighting, hoping that American casualties would become so severe that the United States would offer negotiated terms rather than demand unconditional surrender. Operation Tengo was part of this strategy of attrition through sacrifice. Every kamikaze pilot, every banzai charge, every suicidal naval sortie was intended to increase American casualties, to make the cost of victory so high that the Americans would settle for less than unconditional surrender. The strategy failed because American leadership had learned from the European theater that negotiated settlements with fascist powers were worthless. Franklin Roosevelt had demanded unconditional surrender at the Casablanca Conference in 1943, and Harry Truman continued that policy after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. No amount of Japanese sacrifice would change American terms. The lookouts who detected Yamato on April 7th were witnessing this strategy in action. They were seeing brave men sent to die in a cause their leaders knew was hopeless, sacrificed to demonstrate resolve rather than to achieve tactical objectives. The absence of air cover made the futility explicit. The Japanese weren't even pretending this was a normal naval operation. They were conducting a ritual, and the American lookouts understood they were watching men sail to their execution. This understanding shaped American tactical decisions. Admiral Spruance and Vice Admiral Mitcher could have dispatched surface forces to engage Yamato in a gun duel. The United States had fast battleships operating with Task Force 58. A surface engagement would have been dramatic, possibly even close if Yamato's superior guns found their range, but it would have risked American lives unnecessarily. Why send sailors into harm's way when carrier aircraft could sink the battleship without American casualties? The decision to use exclusively air power was both militarily sound and an acknowledgement that this wasn't a battle between equals. This was an execution. The execution was thorough. The 386 aircraft that attacked Yamato represented the accumulated lessons of 3 years of Pacific War aviation. The pilots knew exactly how to attack a battleship. They knew to concentrate torpedoes on one side to create list. They knew to strafe anti-aircraft positions first. They knew to attack from multiple bearings simultaneously to overwhelm defenses. They had practiced these techniques against Japanese battleships at Leyte Gulf, against the Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, which had absorbed 20 torpedo hits before sinking. They brought that experience to bear on April 7th, and Yamato never had a chance. After the war, surviving crew members struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that their sacrifice had been meaningless. Fukumoto, interviewed decades later, described his absolute belief that Yamato was unsinkable, that individual courage could overcome material disadvantage. The reality of watching the ship capsize, of swimming through oil-slicked water filled with dead comrades, shattered that belief. The survivors returned to a Japan devastated by strategic bombing and atomic weapons, a Japan that had surrendered unconditionally, a Japan where their sacrifice had changed nothing. The American lookouts went home to a different reality. They'd won. The war was over. They could return to civilian life, start families, build careers. Some felt satisfaction at having participated in history. Some felt haunted by the scale of killing. Most simply moved on, their role in the battle becoming a footnote in their personal histories. The radar operators and visual observers who first detected Yamato without air cover had performed their duties professionally. They'd reported what they'd seen, passed the information up the chain of command, and watched as that information translated into overwhelming force applied against a doomed enemy. The strategic lesson of Operation 10 Go was clear to both sides by April 1945, but only one side was willing to acknowledge it. Air power had made surface naval warfare obsolete in contested waters. Battleships without air cover were simply targets. The Japanese had learned this lesson at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf. Yet they sent Yamato anyway, not because they'd forgotten the lesson, but because they valued the gesture more than the outcome. The Americans had learned the same lesson and applied it ruthlessly. They didn't send battleships to fight battleships. They sent aircraft carriers to sink battleships, and they did so with industrial efficiency. This fundamental asymmetry defined the Pacific War's final months. Japan possessed courage, determination, and individual fighting skill. America possessed industrial capacity, technological superiority, and systematic military doctrine. When these forces collided, the outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how many would die before Japan accepted reality. Operation 10 Go added 3,700 names to that toll, men who died following orders they knew were suicidal, executing a mission they knew was futile, serving a cause they knew was lost. The lookouts understood all of this when they detected Yamato sailing without air cover. They understood they were witnessing the death throes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They understood that what they were seeing wasn't warfare in any meaningful sense, but ritual suicide on a national scale. They reported their observations with professional calm because that was their job. But they knew they were watching men sail to their deaths, and they knew those deaths would change nothing about the war's inevitable conclusion. In the final accounting, Operation 10 Go stands as a symbol of military futility, a demonstration that courage and determination cannot overcome systematic material disadvantage. The battleship Yamato, designed to be unsinkable, lasted less than 2 hours against concentrated air attack. Her crew fought bravely, died bravely, and achieved nothing. The American lookouts who first detected her absence of air cover had predicted this outcome in the moment they made their report. They'd seen enough of the Pacific War to understand what was coming. They'd seen the pattern repeated across 2 oceans. Isolated ships without air cover were targets, not combatants. The pattern held true one final time on April 7, 1945, when the largest battleship ever built sailed naked into American air power and paid the inevitable price.